Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories by Ilan Pappe. Some people think of this as a sequel to The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I'll put a link to that video review in the description as well as a card for it. If you think about Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine dealing with 1948, this does deal with 1967 and beyond. And we'll start by talking about what is the term occupation and why Pappe is not entirely happy using it when he's talking here in the book. This book sits uneasily with the term occupation. There are two specific reasons for this reservation, although I accept that it is widely and commonly used in reference to the reality of life in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, both by those who oppose the Israeli presence there and by some mainstream Israeli and Western politicians who did not, or have no wish to, end it. One reservation is that adherence to this term creates the idea of a false separation between Israel and the occupied areas. It indirectly legitimizes the Israeli presence everywhere else in what used to be called mandatory Palestine, and produces the unacceptable dichotomy between democratic Israel and the non-democratic occupied territories. The second reservation concerns the political and legal implications usually associated with the term occupation. It is generally regarded as a temporary means of securing a territory following armed conflict or a war. This has a beginning and an end, and there are very clear international regulations and imperatives that stem from the temporality of any given occupation. The reality in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is different in two very significant aspects. One that emerges from this book is that temporality is not part of the story of this occupation, temporality meaning it being temporary. The powers that be that hold to the territories and those who support the occupier accept the reality of occupation as a given for years to come. By 1987, it had already entered history as the longest existing military occupation, and that record is unlikely to be broken in the foreseeable future. Well, who were the people that decided that this was going to be the case? Contrary to conventional wisdom about the history of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, no one apart from the government of Israel has played a crucial role, then or now, in deciding the fate of these territories or the people living in them. What these ministers decided in the second half of June 1967 and in the following months of July and August, has remained the cornerstone of Israeli policy towards the occupied territories to this day. None of the successive Israeli governments have deviated from this path, and nor have they ever wanted to, in any shape or form. In fact, they had not discovered anything new. Since 1948, they had faced a similar predicament when they and their predecessors had to decide how to treat the Palestinian minority inside Israel. They imposed on them a military rule that was only lifted after 18 years and replaced by a new kind of regime of inspection, control, and coercion. With time, this eased somewhat, but became more hidden and complex. But by now, there were more people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Therefore, while the limited citizenship granted to the Palestinian minority in Israel seemed to tally with the aim of maintaining a decisive Jewish majority in the state, the same would not have been the case had similar citizenship been extended to the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Thus, there was a need to keep the territories, not to expel the people in them, but at the same time not to grant them citizenship. These three parameters or presumptions have remained unchanged to this day. They remain the unholy trinity of the consensual Zionist catechism. Regarding the 1967 war, the common narrative of these events, spun by both the Israeli Foreign Ministry and recounted by the most recent and more neutral Israeli historians, is that Israel fought a war of self-defense in order to preempt an all-Arab attack. This is not what I read in the documents that have recently been released. No one in Israel in a position of command at that time attributed genuine aggressive intentions to either the Egyptians or the Syrians, and definitely not to the Jordanians. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, I did a film club review about an Al Jazeera documentary on the 67 war. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. regarding the role in the U.S. after the assassination of President Kennedy. In a stroke, a new era began that continues to this day, in which Israel is regarded as a member of a unique club of states in whose policies the USA does not, as a rule, interfere, but instead offers only polite protestation when, in the eyes of the rest of the world, they have gone too far, or even in the case of the United States with the bombing of the Liberty, um, Israel is still only, shall we say, politely protested at. If you'd like to learn more about the USS Liberty, I'll put a link in the description as well as a card to one of the book reviews I've done on it. Or, put more diplomatically by the Jewish state's super diplomat Abba Eban, he anticipated a non-critical policy to develop in Washington. He predicted even then that in the long run, the U.S. would endorse, or at least would not reject, the unilateral decisions Israel took about the territories in general and Jerusalem in particular. With the hindsight of 50 years, it is quite astonishing to see just how accurate his prediction was. On the 20th of August 1967, the government in full quorum wanted some sort of overview of the colonization effort. This was an important meeting from which Ilan understood that the question of the legal status of the Palestinians within the occupied territories did not have to be associated with the question of how much territory to colonize. There were quite a few ministers in this meeting who argued that if the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were to be annexed, Israel would have to consider giving the residents there full rights. How to have the cake and eat it, therefore, was the question. The answer was to decide on continued colonization while leaving the question of the status of the Palestinian residents open for a future meeting, which never happened. In 1967, Yitzhak Rabin, then Prime Minister, declared on a visit to these colonies in the Jordan Valley, "These settlements will be here for a very long time. We do not build settlements to evacuate them." Almost 2 decades later, in a speech to the Knesset on the 5th of October 1995, he stated, "Israel would always remain, with the fullest meaning of the verb, in the Jordan Valley. Any space that could be carved out by aligning the initial isolated colonies with one another was to be included in the Jewish state in any prospective peace deal." Ironically, the pace of colonizing that part of the West Bank slowed down when the Likud came to power in 1977, as the new government was interested in channeling resources into colonizing other parts of the West Bank. Allon's map for colonization, dictated largely by demographic considerations, namely, not to annex densely populated Arab areas, was replaced with a colonization plan motivated by the ideology of Greater Israel, which allowed for the annexation of any area coveted by Israel. Ministers noted that the new plan for the unification of Jerusalem added 70,000 Palestinians to Israel's population. They were not deterred by this. It could be offset by the immigration of Jews and the purchase of private Arab lands, Prime Minister Eshkol reassured his cabinet. A more sinister plan, which was eventually implemented, was offered by the Socialist Minister of Agriculture, Haim Gavati. He had overseen the covering of destroyed Palestinian villages in 1948 with Jewish National Fund forests, and considered using the JNF to complete the act of dispossession once again, this time in another way. He suggested allocating some of the newly dispossessed lands to the JNF, since, according to its charter, it is not allowed to sell or let land to non-Jews. He must have been delighted when Eshkol responded by saying, "Ergo, we should give money to the JNF to also buy the private Arab land." The discussion over Gaza took up only a small part of the government's meetings. Most of their consultation was devoted to the fate of the refugee camps in the West Bank as a whole, but the same approach and method was applied to Gaza. Here, too, ministers seemed convinced that mighty Israel could send and resettle these refugees whenever and wherever it wished. Iraq was the preferred destination, as it was in 1948. However, Yaakov Shimshon Shapira, the Minister of Justice, rejected the idea. Because they are the inhabitants of this country, you cannot take them out to Iraq. When Jordan was controlling the West Bank, it was something else. In other words, in 1948 you were entitled to push them from Palestine into the West Bank. He did not believe that a mass expulsion was an option in 1967 as it had been in 1948. Something had changed in the Israeli political elite. In 1948 there was not one voice objecting to the ethnic cleansing of the land. However, in 1967 it was not a small cabal that discussed the ethnic cleansing, but a fully attended cabinet. Ministers concurred that it must be a voluntary flight after all, since, unlike in 1948, they had not actually decided on a mass expulsion. Once again, it was the voice of conscience spoken by Bentov that prevented the government from glossing over this issue so easily. He quoted the new Governor General of Jerusalem, Chaim Herzog, who estimated that 1,000 Palestinians a day were leaving. The army admitted that it was not always as a result of a voluntary flight, but quite often because of the pressure it was applying on people to leave. One military commander bragged about the fact that he intimidated the population under his control to the extent that the area was now totally emptied, Bentov told ministers. He added that he did not find it hard to believe as he had witnessed the army expelling the Golan Heights population at first hand. Bentov made a rare demand that all the Palestinians who had left the West Bank should be repatriated and that the army should cease expelling them. His words speak powerfully of his moral caliber. To some extent, after 1968, most of his friends at the top concurred with him, not on moral grounds, but on the practical grounds that there was no need for further mass expulsions. They found a different formula for ensuring the ethnic purity of the Jewish state: the containment of the Palestinians in their own areas as inhabitants, not citizens. Israeli strategists discovered that if you want to implement ethnic cleansing by other means, the alternative to expulsion is not to allow people to leave the places where they live, and thus they can be excluded from the demographic balance of power. They are contained inside their own areas, but do not have to be counted in the overall national demographic since they cannot freely move, develop, or expand, nor do they have any basic civil and human rights. Glenn Bowman has a word for this strategy: incisation. This is the process of enclosing something within a cyst, and here the Palestinian communities were encircled within territories over which Israel claimed sovereignty. The endorsement of the first settlers by the Labour government, which remained in power until 1977, was ignored by a world that, 50 years later, would regard the Jewish settlements as the principal obstacle to peace. Every Zionist political party supported the settlement of Jews from the very beginning, at least in limited parts of the West Bank. So now Pappe gives us some quotes from different people, and I've labeled this section in their own words. Let's start with Moshe Dayan. This is not the last time we'll hear from this horrible man. We do not need a security pact with the USA. Such a pact will only constitute an obstacle for us. We face no danger at all of an Arab advantage of force for the next 8 to 10 years. Even if they receive massive military aid from the West, we shall maintain our military superiority thanks to our infinitely greater capacity to assimilate new armaments. The security pact will only handcuff us and deny us the freedom of action we need in the coming years. Reprisal actions which we couldn't carry out if we were tied to a security pace are our vital lymph. They make it possible for us to maintain a high level of tension among our population and in the army. Without these actions, we would have ceased to be a combative people, and without the discipline of a combative people, we are lost. We have to cry out that the Negev is in danger, so that young men will go there. And this seems to be Dayan's future for Israel into infinity. You always have to maintain danger so that people remain militarized, and so Israel can never develop, in a sense, as a regular country. It always has to be ready to fight at any time for any reason. And he's basically implying if there isn't a reason, we have to make up a reason. Moshe Dayan admitted that Israel's policy in that period, this is the 1967 period, was provocative and was pursued specifically to appease the Jewish settlers near the Syrian border. These settlers, explained Dayan, had since 1949 been demanding that Israel occupy the Golan Heights. Many of the firefights with the Syrians were deliberately provoked by Israel, pressed by the kibbutzim residents. In hindsight, Dayan did not put down the settlers' main concerns to a desire for greater protection from Syrian bombardment, but rather to their appetite for more farmland. They did not even try to hide their greed for the land, he stated. Is Dayan an anti-Semite for calling them greedy for the land? Speaking in 1969, Dayan gave the game away. Our fathers had reached the frontiers which were recognized in the UN Partition Plan of 1947, 56% of the land. Our generation reached the frontiers of 1949, 78% of the land. Now the six-day generation of 1967 has managed to reach Suez, Jordan, and the Golan Heights. This is not the end. So keep in mind, he's talking about 1967. He's saying we need more, that everything that was taken in 67 is not enough. So this is quoting Levi Eshkol on the 18th of June. We cannot expel the Palestinians of Jerusalem, 70,000 in number, but we have to understand that we are dangerously increasing the number of Arabs in Israel. We are also getting 200,000 refugees. There are 400,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We should negotiate with Jordan their transfer to Jordan. Remember, the idea of Greater Israel is always more land, fewer Arabs. So there's always a danger in their mind, oh, we can't increase the number of Arabs, that's horrible. We have to get rid of these people. And so they're thinking we can send them to Jordan. Here's more from Moshe Dayan. For me, the important issue is our internal decision, not what we are going to broadcast outside. We have to operate on the basis of principles. The Jordan River is the border. The 1,250,000 in the West Bank are not going to be Israeli citizens. And Yerushalayim Hashlema, unified Jerusalem in Hebrew, he meant it should always be unified. They, the inhabitants, should be administered by a military rule until further decision. After that, they should run their lives in an autonomy, and if this does not work, I would rather have them as Jordanian citizens than Israeli ones. Running their lives under military rule, as long as the River Jordan is our border, is also not a bad option. So Dayan's considering all sorts of things here, none of which really have any precedent, but it shows the flexibility that they're feeling in this time period, that no one's going to oppose them, they're in charge, they have military supremacy, they can do what they want. In those days, it was the Minister of Education, Zalman Aran, of the ruling Mapai party, and the Minister of Tourism from the Liberal Party, Moshe Kol, who did most of the work in this field. Aran is quoted in the minutes as saying, "We should say something, not necessarily mean something." What he meant was that they should say something about their wish to seek peace, but not really mean it. And this has happened over and over and over throughout the years with Israel. In June 1967, Berg echoed Dayan in making a clear link between the idea that there would not be peace, or as he put it, there would never be a partner for peace, and the justification for Israel's unilateral policies on the ground. No partner for peace became quite a common slogan, one used by future Israeli politicians for excusing hostile actions against the Arab population. As the veteran Zionist Berg put it, we are going to have to hold on to the territories for a very long time, while claiming, outside, we wish to make peace. It's in their own words. This isn't Pappe's conspiracy theory. He's quoting people and letting the rest of us know what they said. For many ministers, the main worry was the large number of 1948 refugees within the occupied territories. Yaakov Shimshon Shapira, the Minister of Justice, said, "We should establish a ministry for refugees with the purpose of encouraging their emigration, especially the young elements, because they are very dangerous and they are the worst." He argued that Israel should demand the exclusive right to solve the question. We cannot repeat 1948. We should give them a month to return, and if 5,000 would return, this is not a big problem, and we would have a different image in the world. So, a token repatriation of 5,000 people, that would be great for them, PR wise. That's the calculus. The principal means used to expand the East Jerusalem wedge were systematic land robbery, colonization, the designation of certain areas as green spaces, the ecological lungs of the new metropolis, namely, no-go areas for Palestinians, house demolitions, and a repeated refusal to allow extensions to existing buildings for Palestinians. Another means of extending this wedge was a disinclination to invest in any infrastructure for future Palestinian housing and habitats, although the Palestinian citizens paid the same taxes as the Jewish settlers. To the aesthetic crimes against the city of Jerusalem can be added those of culture and religion. One of the most important parts of the Mamilla area was its Muslim cemetery dating back to the 7th century. The graves were removed at night so that no one could witness this, and in their place the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation built a museum of tolerance. I mean, you can't make this up. To ensure that Muslims could not reach this sacred site, it was surrounded by an electric fence. Desecrating Muslim graveyards for new constructions was nothing new, however. The old cemetery in Haifa, Al-Istiklal, was desecrated in a similar way when a highway was driven through it, scattering the gravestones to either side. If you're finding this content helpful, I can't say if you're liking this content, it's not very likable content, but if you are finding this useful, please consider hitting like or subscribe. It's a very easy way that you can support our work here, and consider sharing it with people who might also be interested. When you think about the military rule that's in place in the occupied territories, effective military rule, you have to realize there's a history to this. Again, as we've seen in other cases, the Jews did not come up with this stuff out of nowhere. It was modeled for them by the British. But how did they feel about it when the British put it forward? When these regulations were first imposed in 1948 and again in 1967, no one mentioned the fact that when they were originally introduced by the British Mandate, they were condemned by all Zionist leaders as Nazi legislation. These leaders described them as regulations with no parallel in any enlightened country, and continued that even in Nazi Germany there were no such rules, and the actions of Majdanek and its like had been done out of violation of the written law. So it can't be used against them, but they're able to use it against other people. The two most notorious regulations were and still are number 109, allowing the governor to expel the population, and number 110, which gave him the right to summon any citizen to a police station whenever he saw fit. Another infamous regulation was number 111, which sanctioned administrative arrest and arrest for an unlimited period with neither explanation nor trial. Acquiring land by force after hostilities have ended is illegal under international law. Military action and occupation are legal only if they are for self-defense, or for the direct benefit of the indigenous population. From the very beginning it was clear that Palestinian land was acquired for the purpose of de facto annexation. In this, Israel violated the second article of the UN 1945 Charter. The first settlement built on the occupied territories was a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It is illegal to colonize occupied land or transfer a non-indigenous population to that land. The grabbing of land began with a series of decrees within the context of the emergency regulations. They were issued in 1967. The first was Decree number 25, which declared that every land transaction had to be authorized by the official authority. The next significant Decree number 59 proclaimed that the same year stipulated that any land owned by the Jordanian government, of which there were 160,000 dunams, was now to be transferred to the State of Israel. State pillaging within the context of this decree was based on an 1855 Ottoman law whereby any uncultivated and non-private land would become state land. We're coming back to our good friend Moshe Dayan. Under his guidance, the government rejected Red Cross demands, according to the Geneva Convention of which Israel was a signatory, to provide food distribution for the population, protection from expulsion, and supervision of the application of pre-occupation laws. The government's legal advisor, Yosef Tekoa, confirmed that all this was indeed according to the letter and spirit of the Geneva Convention. But Tekoa shared Dayan's concern. He explained that acceptance of the Geneva Convention in relation to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would mean Israel acknowledging that Jordan and Egypt were respectively the sovereign states there. Not one minister was willing to risk such a development. There was and is now only one sovereign state, Israel, and nothing will change it in the years to come. Not even the UN General Assembly resolution in December 2012 that granted Palestine the status of a UN observer state. The official decision to colonize was a grave violation of international law. The Geneva Convention requires an occupying power to affect the existing order in the occupied territory as little as possible during its tenure. One aspect of this obligation is that it must leave the territory to the people it finds there. Another vital obligation decreed in Article 49 of the Geneva Convention states, "The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies." Remember, all these laws are for other people. They're not for the chosen people. From the very beginning, the lawmakers of the occupied territories adopted a functional and cynical approach to international law. These areas were alternately treated as part of the Israeli legal system and also outside that system in order to serve best the strategy of colonizing them. The imposition of the non-democratic military law was justified as emanating from the duties and privileges that international law granted Israel as an occupying force. However, whenever international law threatened to interfere with the colonization effort, such as preventing Jewish settlers moving into the area and the expulsion of Palestinians from them, then Israeli law was invoked. This elaborate dual system was finalized by the mid-1970s. Now we're speaking about Ariel Sharon, another horrible creature. More specifically, Sharon was looking for ways of overcoming the hurdle put in his way by the Israeli Supreme Court, which ruled that only public land could be confiscated. Under his guidance, and with the help of the legal experts of the military rule in the occupied territories, the civil administration, land ownership there was redefined in a way that allowed Israel to claim that much of the land was or would become state land. One of the leading bureaucrats in the military administration came up with the idea in a meeting Sharon had with all of the relevant officials following another clear decision by the Supreme Court not to allow confiscation of private land. This individual is what one might call an Orientalist, an expert on such subjects as Ottoman law, and he suggested that certain land in the West Bank could be defined as mawat, or dead land, in accordance with the Ottoman land law of the 19th century. According to that law, land that was not cultivated for 3 years could pass into the hands of the Ottoman Empire or state. The next day, Sharon flew off in his helicopter, and in an apparently endless exercise, pointed out to his subordinates from the air land that looked deserted, before flying back to instruct his staff, toiling away at the drawing board to include it as mawat, land, on the map. It goes without saying that the Ottoman experience was entirely irrelevant to the colonization of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but was part of the tacit agreement between the Supreme Court and the existing bureaucracy as to how to kosherize, within a respectable legal infrastructure, the colonization of more and more areas within the West Bank. So they know that they're stealing. They know that they're lying, but they want to find legal cover for their thieving and their lies. Sharon's principal contribution to the solidification of the mega prison was a systematic approach that removed any ambiguity in the implementation of the 1967 strategy. He brought colonization to every corner of the West Bank. One significant change was the exclusion of Palestinians from planning bodies and committees. Finding, for instance, that there were token Palestinians in the Planning Council Sharon replaced it with a new one called the Chamber of Planning, which had hardly any Palestinian members. The Chamber of Planning was an incredible exercise in cynicism and deception. Officially, its remit was to help with the future development of the 400 Palestinian villages in the West Bank in the next decade, which would have been the 1980s. When the Chamber announced it would look into planning issues concerning such a large number of villages in the West Bank, what it meant in essence was that it would search for further ways of confining and containing these villages in order to limit their natural expansion and growth. Such decisions eventually became a mirror image of those taken with regard to the Jewish colonies. Those taken with regard to Palestinians were intended to curb the natural growth of the population, while the Jewish ones were meant to encourage such growth and development. To the outside world, this newspeak brought Israel immunity from criticism. After all, what was wrong with catering to the needs of the occupied rural areas? It wouldn't be a book about Palestine if we didn't talk about the violence that was exerted by the Israelis onto the Palestinians. With Dayan's full knowledge, Sharon was the first to employ the method of collective punishment in response to the early resistance in the Strip. Sharon's policy included the demolition of houses, mass arrests without trial, long hours of curfew, and violent break-ins into houses and huts. In 2008, an official website commemorating Sharon's life and achievements was established in which, rather than hiding his role in Gaza in those days, proudly lauded it. Sharon participates in these searches himself. He orders the soldiers to perform a full-body search on all males and sometimes imposes curfews on refugee camps in order to conduct a search. The clear goal of the mission is finding terrorists and killing them. The soldiers have orders not to try and capture the terrorists alive. Sharon instructs them to be rough with the local population, to perform searches in the streets, and even to strip subjects naked if necessary. To shoot to kill any Arab who holds a gun, to shoot to kill any Arab who does not obey a stop call, and to diminish the risk to their lives by employing a big volume of fire, by uprooting trees from orchards, which makes it difficult to capture terrorists, by demolishing houses and driving out their owners to other houses in order to pave secure roads. Haider Abed al-Shafi, senior Palestinian leader, says, Sharon took a decision to open roads in al-Shatea camp and in Rafah for security. That led to removing houses, the houses of refugees, which is an action not to be taken lightly. But there was no objection either from Dayan or from the Israeli government. They let Sharon realize his aim, and he really destroyed a lot of refugee homes. Eli Landau, political ally and a friend of Ariel Sharon, says, he was a very senior officer going with the troops from house to house, from bunker to bunker, from orange grove to orange grove, to explain what he meant. 3 months later, Gaza was quiet. The terror was crushed with an iron fist, with a vicious hand. He cast fear in Gaza. He was feared. Marie Therese, a Catholic nun, wrote in her church's paper, "Here's what the Israelis do not want us to see. 3 villages destroyed systematically by TNT and bulldozers." She noted that the villagers were forced to leave in a hurry, unable to take anything with them. Their fields were deserted in the middle of work, and she could see tractors from nearby kibbutzim that were quick to cultivate the village's lands. An Israeli journalist, Amos Kenan, had also witnessed the expulsion, but his report was only published 30 years later in Haaretz. I wonder why. Kenan was one of the soldiers who took part in the demolition of Beit Nuba, and he wrote, "We were told the 3 villages have to be destroyed for strategic reasons, and also as a revenge for them being a launching pad for terrorist attacks in the past and potentially so in the future." So they're destroying for reasons of the future. The very last moment of Beit Nuba's existence comes to life in his articulate writings. Elegant stone houses, orchards of fruit trees around each house, olives, peach and vine trees, and next to them cedars. All the orchards nicely cultivated and maintained. In the morning, the first bulldozer arrived and demolished the first house. In 10 minutes, the house, the orchard, and the trees were gone. The house and its contents were destroyed. After the 3rd house was destroyed, the refugees' convoy began to make its way towards Ramallah. And remember, they're going to tell you that these were backwards peasants who didn't know what to do with the land. And what does a Jewish soldier tell us? Elegant stone houses, orchards of fruit trees around each house, olives, peach, and vine trees, all the orchards nicely cultivated and maintained. So when this was bulldozed, they had to bring in non-native trees to cover up their crime. The three picturesque villages are now hidden by Canada Park, a pine forest of the kind planted in the aftermath of the 1948 ethnic cleansing as a means of covering such atrocities, and part of Beit Nuba's land now forms a new colony named Beit Horon. In August 1987, the Israeli military in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip published a booklet proudly announcing how successful its rule in the last 20 years had been. Color photographs of happy Palestinians were juxtaposed with black and white pictures of gloomy Palestinians from the pre-June 1967 period. The main reason for such pride was the increased standard of living in comparison to the 1950s. Who is to say it would not have grown under Jordanian rule as well, but that was hardly the point. When 4 months later, the First Intifada erupted, it was clear that the improved standard of living, if indeed this is what it had been, was part of the open prison concept against which the Palestinians arose. The booklet was withdrawn hastily from bookshops at the beginning of the Intifada. They knew that the propaganda wasn't believable anymore. Soldiers frequently used gunfire in situations that did not present mortal danger to troops, causing many avoidable deaths and injuries. IDF troops used clubs to break limbs and beat Palestinians who were not directly involved in disturbances or resisting arrest. At least 13 Palestinians have been reported to have died from beatings. The Swedish branch of Save the Children estimated that between 23,600 and 29,900 children required medical treatment for injuries sustained from beatings in the first 2 years of the Intifada, a third of whom were under the age of 10. Imagine what kind of person you have to be to beat a 10-year-old child. The town of Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip, like all the other towns and villages in the West Bank and the Strip, was placed under military curfew for 3 days. This short period was enough for the army to perform its routine devastation. Muhammad Ahmad al-Astal, who was then 24 years old, recalled how the soldiers burst into the house where his family usually gathered, about 10 Palestinian men in all. The soldiers took 4 of them to another room. He remained with 3 other members of the family. 2 of them were taken by the soldiers to a corner of the room and beaten with rifle stocks. They were also punched, slapped, and kicked. He and another family member were ordered to empty the cupboard of its contents, clothing, and other household items. In his own words, "The soldiers called me over, slapped me on the face, and told me, 'You are Hamas.' I returned to empty the cupboard, but I was called over again. This time they told me, 'You are Islamic Jihad,' and slapped me again. There was a third round of abuse in which he was told, 'You are PLO.' Another man in the room was treated in a similar way. Then they were both summoned. One soldier held me by the neck and banged our heads together." It turned out that in the next room the same abuse was taking place, and that they were united with 2 men from the other room and ordered to stand facing the wall with their hands up in the air. The soldiers gave us back our ID cards to hold up in the air and told us to remain like this. After half an hour, the older members of the family told them the soldiers had left. Hassan Abed al-Saida Abu Labada, 29 years old and married with 2 children, also a resident of Khan Yunis, was woken up by soldiers at 2 in the morning with a blow in the face from a soldier's rifle, followed by more blows. His brother Manar, 23 years old, was taken out of his bed and thrown into the family car, parked in the yard. The soldiers asked about the whereabouts of Jamal Abu Samhadana, a man he did not know. He was punched in the face and then forced into the routine emptying of cupboards. The soldiers cut up the sofa with a knife, and in his own words, "They found a kitchen knife in the kitchen." "What is it?" "It is a bread knife," I answered. "The soldiers punched me on the nose with the knife. I was wounded and bled. The soldier took a sack of rice and demanded that I empty it on the floor. I said it was only rice, so he emptied it himself and then took an oil can and poured it on the cloths and the rice. They left. Nobody was arrested, and nothing was taken. Fatma Hassan Tabash Sufian, 61 years old, married and a mother of 4, was woken up on the 6th of April 1993 at 3 o'clock in the morning. Soldiers broke into her house, pushed her up against the wall, and asked her where her children were. They are asleep, she replied. They woke up her son Saad, 30 years old, kicking him and beating him with their hands and rifle stocks until he was spitting blood all over the place. Her other son, Ibrahim, was badly beaten, and the B'Tselem researcher who took Fatma's evidence testified that long after the incident he could still see signs of ecchymosis, subcutaneous bleeding, on his back. Both sons were taken out to the yard and put against a wall. The soldiers found 2 toy guns and began slashing the 2 men with them until the toys broke. Then they gathered everyone in the complex, 27 people, into one room and threw in a shock grenade. Saad and Ibrahim were ordered to empty the cupboard while they were continuously beaten by the soldiers shouting at them, "You are Hamas and we are Golani." Nor did they spare Fatma's old, blind brother, who was 100 years old. He too was abused by the soldiers, who threw mattresses and blankets at him. I ask you again, imagine harming a 100-year-old person in the same way that you would beat a 10-year-old child. Who are these people? Do they have humanity within them? Alas, the list of state-sponsored brutality did not end there. The Palestinians faced demolition of their houses, unlike before, this time without prior warning, the destruction of their rural infrastructure, the uprooting of olive trees and the ruination of crops, and probably the most sinister of all in this list of evils, the redirection of water away from their towns and villages, in many cases to the benefit of Jewish settlements, which, after the Intifada, sold that water for a higher price back to the Palestinians, from whom the water had been stolen in the first place. The head of the Israeli military intelligence, Shlomo Gazit, explained that this destruction of the infrastructure was intentional. Israel wanted the Palestinians to face unemployment and a shortage of land and water, and thus we can create the necessary conditions for the departure of the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. Again, the Israelis' flawed and stupid theory that if you make it bad enough for the population that they will desert their land, not realizing that these people learned their lesson in 1948 and are now rather going to die on the land than desert it. The two motivating forces of the Likud, to cater for the socio-economic problems of marginalized Jewish groups, the Mizrahi and the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and a commitment to a greater Israel, refused into the particular impact the new government had on the nature of the Judaization of the West Bank. Now we get to the settlers. Mizrahi Jews from poor neighborhoods were offered a new life in the West Bank settlements, and to an extent also in the Gaza Strip settlements. They would later be referred to as economic settlers, namely those who, so the Israeli left hoped, in vain, might be returned to Israel with financial compensation. Their younger generation would be indoctrinated by the settler movement. One such graduate was Yigal Amir, who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995. The ultra-Orthodox, who had been crammed into inhabitable slums in Jerusalem and Bnei Brak, near Tel Aviv, moved to new exclusive ultra-Orthodox towns in the West Bank. Apart from serving the demographic strategy of the Likud government, they were also allowed to create for themselves autonomous theocratic enclaves, immune from Israel's legal practice or cultural norms. Thus, ultra-Orthodox non-Zionist Jews created their devout entities that were not tolerated in the more secular Jewish state, and could impose the rule of exclusion and inclusion, which was impossible within the pre-1967 borders. If you want to know what the ultimate theocratic Jewish state looks like, you should visit one of these enclaves. The isolated colony of Kedumim, one of the veteran post-1967 settlements, still exists today as an Orthodox enclave, where women wearing trousers are not welcome, and men dressed like early American settlers in the Wild West, down to their beards and guns in their holsters like Al-Qaeda fighters. In such colonies, the synagogue is the center of the community, and the rabbi's sermons are a mixture of anti-Arab racism and Jewish messianism. Sounds great. The colonies also developed as the equivalent of offshore tax havens. Cheap Palestinian labor was employed, taxes were cut, as the Likud government regarded these colonies as deserving preferential treatment since they were located in security risk areas, which granted them special tax concessions and allowed for subsidy in every aspect of life. In 1967, around 300,000 Palestinians lived in Area C. Today, there are a mere 50,000. You're not sure what Area C is? This is referring to classifications post-Oslo. I recently did a film club on this. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. On the other hand, the Jewish population has increased from about 1,000 in 1967 to more than 400,000 today. So 300,000 Palestinians gone down to 50,000, 1,000 Jews to 400,000. Ilan has some harsh words for Oslo, as do many of us, I suppose. So, in truth, without the application of extreme pressure, there is no reason in the world why a native population would ever volunteer to partition its homeland with a settler movement. And therefore, we should see that the Oslo process was actually not a fair and equal pursuit of peace, but a compromise made by a defeated, colonized people. As a result, the Palestinians were forced to seek solutions that went against their interests and endangered their very existence. The lack of attention to the refugee question during the peace negotiation was not new. Ever since the beginning of the peace efforts in post-Mandatory Palestine, refugees have been exposed to a campaign of repression and negligence. Ever since the first peace conference on post-1948 Palestine, the Lausanne meeting of April 1949, the refugee problem was excluded from the peace agenda and disassociated from the concept of the Palestine conflict. Israel participated in this conference only because it was a precondition for its acceptance as a full member in the UN, which also demanded that Israel sign the May Protocol, in which it had to commit itself to the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which included an unconditional call for the Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return to their homes or to be given appropriate compensation. A day after the protocol was signed in May 1949, Israel was admitted to the UN and immediately retracted from its commitment to the protocol. They've been signaling this all throughout. Remember, we will say things, we will do things, but we will mean different things for ourselves. We're going to go to a conference, we'll sign a paper, but once we get what we want, which was admission to the UN, we'll retract our signature. The refugee problem, the heart of the Palestine conflict, a reality acknowledged by all the Palestinians wherever they are, and by anyone sympathizing with the Palestinian cause, was marginalized in the Oslo documents. Instead, the issue was handled by a short-lived multilateral group who were asked to focus on the 1967 refugees, namely the Palestinians who were expelled or left after the June War. And once again, if you understand that the refugee problem is at the heart of the Palestinian problem, then you can see why Oslo failed from the very beginning. If you enjoyed this review, one of the ways that you can help this channel, as I talked about earlier, is by hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with people who are open-minded to learning more and realizing what is actually happening now and what has happened in the past. If you'd like to buy a copy of this book, that's another way you can support the channel. There's links to do that in the description below. If you want to thank me particularly for this video, consider using Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. They're linked in the description. And if you'd like to support the work on a more ongoing basis, there are links to my Patreon and YouTube membership below. These are ways to get access to these videos earlier, as well as have conversations with me behind the scenes and get access to member-only videos in which I talk about different books that I'm working on presentations for. If you'd like to nominate a book for the future, you'll find them on my Amazon wish list. When you click on that in the description, you'll see different genres. You'll see books that have nothing to do with Palestine, and if that's the case, that's for my Stephen Heiner main channel. Feel free to go over and take a look at what we're doing there as well. But obviously, if you want to nominate books for this channel, pick a Palestine book, send it my way, and that will, in a sense, sponsor the video. I'll put it into my queue and try to review it as quickly as I can. Reminder that when this channel eventually gets monetized, 100% of the profits of the channel are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. There's a link to them in the description. Please visit them. Consider supporting them directly to help Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. You can also support them indirectly by helping this channel get monetized. You can do that by watching as many videos as you can, and that will get us where we need to be for YouTube. Until next time, enjoy your reading.